Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Katie Carpenter. I'm not Mara. Mara couldn't come. But on her behalf, I'm saying that this is the 24th Woodstock Film Festival, which means next year is going to be really a big deal, 25th Film Festival. And we should all come. Plan now. Book your rooms, your flights, whatever. Not flights. That's carbon intensive. Because today, we're going to talk about greening your film. Some of you know, we did a panel here not long ago about green production. And for those of you who make movies and docs, you know you can reduce your carbon emissions. There's all kinds of great ways to do that. And at the Producers Guild, with partners at the studios, we started a website called greenproductionguide.com. And check it out, because there's a lot of cool stuff on there. It's buzzy. There's ways to calculate your carbon footprint, things that you need to know. You might want to know, and we hope you do. But today we're talking about climate storytelling, which is kind of the next iteration of this. How you get the climate messages and the climate themes and the climate people into your movies without pissing off your distributor. No, without wrecking the flow. So we have some people on our panel today who are going to be able to talk about that. But before they do, I have to tell you there's two secrets right here in this valley, ways you can green your film. One is Upriver Studios, and I don't know if Beth or Mary Stewart are here, but they run a studio over there, which houses a lot of studio and HBO projects, and they can bring your film in carbon neutral, which is amazing. They know how to do it all. And then if you feel like you want one extra little bump, there's biochar. And I don't know if you guys know what biochar is, but we have a biochar machine here. Sarah Johnson runs it at the back of the... And there's Sarah Johnson, yay! Just in time, perfect. So I've just been blathering until I got to the point where I could say, Sarah Johnson, we are grateful to you for all you do for film and all you do for the planet. And it's a great combo. And pretty soon we'll have all these people converted. So I'm going to turn it over to our panel moderator. He's going to introduce the rest. It's Peter Saraf, who was very important to this movement. Many years ago, maybe 10, 11 years ago, we started it all with a film called Away We Go, which is the first movie we ran a carbon calculation on. 975 metric tons of carbon. Let me tell you, that is almost nothing. Yay, Peter. So, Peter, come on up and bring your panelists. Hi. So Peter's going to go there. Meredith, why don't you go? We're going to do Lydia second, Tim third. Well, I don't know when he's speaking, but he's going to sit there. And Meredith's going to sit here, because everybody's going to face you. No.
Well, Meredith's going to do her...
She's going to do a walkabout.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for being here on this gorgeous Sunday afternoon. And you are... this is not just the last panel of the day. This is the last panel of the film festival this year. So thanks for being here. And we're going to... talk a little bit about what Katie just introduced. But I just want to say a few things before we get started. And so just to set the stage a little bit, so last week was Yom Kippur. And I'm not a particularly religious person, but as my grandfather used to say, it's once a year, just in case. And I'm interested in spiritual things, and Yom Kippur is a holiday that is often called the Day of Atonement, when we reflect on the past year and we think about ways that we fell short and ways that we could have done better, and how are we going to approach the new year doing a little better, and how are we going to not miss the mark in ways that we have before. And at this year's Yom Kippur service that I went to, they broke that word down, and they broke it down to at one meant, and with the idea that not just our own behavior, but how as a community, how as one, how do we work towards the greater good, and how did we miss the mark as a community, as a society, as a neighborhood, as a group, in ways that we could work together better. And that just struck me as very thematic to what we're talking about. Because I don't know about you, but I find myself thinking about the climate crisis that we're living in and through, and I find myself confused, I find myself full of rage, I find myself feeling hopeless, I also find myself in this moment when we're actually starting to talk about it in real ways and starting to take real political action and starting to wake up to what's going up around us. I find myself a little bit hopeful, and I find myself a little bit optimistic, and I find myself inspired by the things that are happening. But when I feel this kind of confliction and lost a little bit, I always turn to storytelling to figure out how I can behave and what's going to lead us forward as a society. Because I think we always organize ourselves and our groups around stories, and I think it's always incumbent upon the artists to imagine the future and imagine a future that is better than it might be otherwise, and to imagine a future so that we have one, which I think we're at an existential moment where some of us question that. So that's what we're here to talk about today, is to talk about how does storytelling address the issue of the climate, environment, and all of that. And we have this incredible panel with us today. So Lydia Dean Pilcher, who's here, and so I'm going to look at my notes a little bit, but Lydia is an extraordinary film and television producer and director and a labor leader in sustainability, and she'll talk about the work that she's doing in that regard, amongst other stuff. And so, and as a producer and director, amongst her many credits are films you've seen like Cutie and the Boxer, The Namesake, Vanity Fair, Darjeeling Limited, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, Radium Girls, and at this year's film festival, she has this extraordinary multi-screen installation that's a climate story called Homing Instinct. It's at the Kleinert James Art Center right here on Tinker Street, and it closes at 5:30 today.
Last screenings at 5:30.
Last screenings at 5:30 today.
28
so if you
minutes.
race out of here in your electric vehicle down Tinker Street, you might catch the last screening. But it's great. It's this multi-screen, really installation we'll talk about a little bit. And then next, and then I'm going to talk about Meredith on the far end a little bit. Meredith came out from Los Angeles to be with us here today. We're very grateful. She's the creative director of the NRDC's Rewrite the Future, which we're going to talk a lot about, and Meredith's going to do a slideshow presentation about the work that she's doing with Rewrite the Future. She's also a producer and former studio executive at Searchlight, Lionsgate, and Summit. She was an EP on The Eyes of Tammy Faye and oversaw a diverse slate of films as an exec, including The Favorite and the Step Up franchise. And then we have an incredible bonus guest star in Tim Guinea, who is going to tell us, who's an actor and an activist and a multi-hyphenate, and has been working in really important ways around this subject matter for a while. And since he's a late ad, I'm going to let him introduce himself.
So rather than kind of bloviate on my hyphenates, I'll just tell you that one thing I've done is given hundreds of climate talks in communities, lots of mosques in ghettos in North Africa, Baptist churches in the United States, and conservative fire departments, and in maximum security prisons, and on factory floors, and in the mansions of Houston oil industry executives. And rather than bloviate on my hyphenates because of what you said, I'm going to tell a 1-minute story. And it's a story I learned from a rabbi in Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, and I'm Irish, so it's all a mess that I'm going to tell you this, and it's cultural appropriation, and I'm going with it. So there's a fantastic Talmudic Hebrew expression called bira deleket. And a bira deleket is a house engulfed in flames. And the old Talmudic story is there's a man walking down a road, a traveler, and he sees this house fully engulfed in flames. And weirdly, there's a man standing inside this house with his head leaning out of the window. He's in the flames. And the traveler screams to him, who is the master of this house? And the man inside the fire says, I'm the master. And what the rabbi said was, we often forget that the house that's on fire, the house that we're burning down, has God in it as well. That we're burning down God in God's house. And the rabbi said, often we'll be sitting there, we'll be sitting in the living room, and we'll think, there's a fire, but it's upstairs in the bedroom. We forget that there are people in the bedroom. We forget that the fire in the kitchen has somebody's cat in it, that there are people sitting in that fire. And we forget. And we forget. But the beautiful thing about the Old Talmudic Hebrew is Bira Deleket has another meaning, which is illuminated house, suggesting we're at a moment of illumination. We are at a moment that calls for the very best of us, that calls for the most love that we can give. And that's the moment we're in now.
Beautiful. Thank you, Tim. Lydia, do you want to talk a little bit about your what's going on in terms of there's a real movement going on in entertainment world in terms of storytelling. Will you tell us a little bit about that?
It's starting to happen here. It's been happening more in Europe for a while. We're a little bit behind, but I think we're starting to catch up, which is exciting. I've been working in sustainability in our film industry and television industry for about 15 years with Katie Carpenter. And what we've seen is, it's very difficult to make change within the industry, and it's easier to make change from outside the industry. So we're starting to really put a lot of our emphasis on organized labor, and with the acceleration of climate change, there has been a real acceleration of interest from every group across our industry in organizing in every community. So in the Producers Guild, we have convened an inter-guild alliance with the IATSE, with the Writers Guild, with the actors, with the Teamsters, with the Directors Guild, and we're all kind of working together on a production level. Mostly we've prioritized clean energy. And on a content level, we're really starting to organize ourselves to, create more systems within the studio, which is what Meredith is going to talk about, because she's part of Natural Resources Defense Council, which has been an organization that the studios have really respected in terms of their longevity in this area. It's interesting because they do a lot of litigation around policy, but we're going to talk more about that as we get into the panel. But I just wanted to say, this year, for the first time, we convened all the organizations that were involved in climate storytelling on any level, and it turned out to be about 60 organizations and groups in our industry. So it's everybody from production companies and studios to unions to impact groups and research groups and academic institutions like USC Annenberg and the Yale Climate Communications Program. We've all kind of come together to kind of see where we are and how do we work together so we can really amplify everything that we're all doing and help each other. And I think, communicating and bringing climate into our content is of paramount importance, because we have come to learn, actually from a USC Annenberg study, that there's a climate silence in our film and television. And we've begun to kind of peel this back. Why does this exist? Why is this happening? What is the systemic blockade? Is it the studio mentality? Is it the fossil fuel companies and the narratives that the fossil fuel companies are putting out there to deflect responsibility onto the individual as opposed to the system? So we've been looking at all of this and figuring out the way that we can push a vision forward that really takes into account the fact that we are all facing a climate-altered future, but we still do have time to do something about it, and we have the agency to do something about it, and that's where we as storytellers come in.
Wonderful. That brings up so many questions. But so I love that you're doing this intersectionality with all of the. It's for those of you who don't know, to bring all the different factions of our industry together is a tremendous challenge. And Lydia, this is something that you've done before. With PGA Green, which was first I knew you as a wonderful producer, and then I became aware of you as this incredible activist who did what was seemingly impossible, which was get all of the major studios to volunteer to sign on to green production guides so that we could make the actual process of making film and television shows sustainable. And now it seems like you're continuing that work into the content space. So when you find these 60 organizations or companies and groups and whatever all doing this work, is the intent, can you just talk a little bit about the intention of finding commonality around those groups and working together and it's supportive?
Well, we're trying to identify the gaps in our knowledge, the gaps in our systems and our programs. I mean, when we put all the research that was happening together, we realized there was duplication. We realized that some people had resources that other people could take advantage of. So there was this kind of immediate, like, wow, we just kind of synergized something here. And in the research, we realized there were things that we need to do more research about. One of the things that I'm fascinated with is the psychological distancing factor that we have between our reality and our future and our inability to kind of pick our head up to think about it as opposed to looking away and not thinking about it. This is something that the groups are very interested in focusing on. And I think that, it really is about, I think everything about making change in the world is about community organizing and community building. And so I think wherever we are, whatever our community is, if it's IATSE, the Teamsters, the directors, we need to organize in our own communities. And I think that, having this overview of the common goal, will help people plug in more easily.
That's fantastic. I love that. And then you mentioned sort of the resistance to, or the silence around the climate conversation in the stories that we are telling. And Tim and Meredith jump in on this as well. Why do we think that is? I mean, is it a conspiracy against this? Is it? I've found in the films and television stories that I've done, people are really terrified of science because it feels like, ooh, if you're talking real science in a story, it's going to feel like homework. And we were talking a little bit earlier about, making stories that people want to see, not only stories that they feel like they should see, because that's a bigger overcome. Why do you think there's a resistance to telling these kind of stories or incorporating these topics into these stories?
I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons, to be honest. They're tough topics. People have a lot of preconceptions about it as being homework or politically divisive or boring or depressing. And I think it's really interesting because, we're an industry of storytellers who've convinced ourselves of a narrative that's actually false. If you tell the stories well, and you tell them in the way that stories should be told, which is not lectures, but like deeply entertaining and relatable and sometimes scary and sometimes cathartic and hopefully inspiring in some capacity, then it's the same rules apply to telling stories about climate that apply to telling any kind of story. But yes, we have a whole lot of preconceived notions that are holding us back. And when I dive into the presentation, I can talk about that more, but to me, that's what it is.
One of the things that I think happens is people are afraid of this subject, that they're afraid they're going to get depressed by it. And one of the difficulties, in my opinion, with making movies about this, and I think it's true if you're reading an article or a book, if you're only taking the knowledge in and you're not becoming active, you get depressed. It's like taking poison in. And a challenge, I think, to filmmaking is also providing avenues for people to get active. And I work in this space. I work with Vice President Gore's organization. I'm in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Anyhow, all kinds of stuff. And I work in this every single day. And I am not depressed in the least because I'm active. But that's a leap. And it's a tough leap because if you don't take it, what you want to do is avoid the subject. And the subject won't be avoided. It's going to rain in New York last weekend. It's like a mouse that's nibbling at your toe all the time. You can't deny this thing. It's coming. So your choices really are to get active or go into depression. And I think one of the challenges is the fear of going into depression and watching these movies, and a perception of that by producing entities.
We don't go to the movies to get depressed? I thought that's why we went.
In the 60s, we did.
Oh, well, that's what,
I know, Requiem for a Dream.
well, no, cathartic. You mentioned cathartic. Some of these stories are cathartic. And Lydia, that sort of, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about your project, Homing Instinct, which, you know, you are telling a climate story, and what brought you to that, and what brought you to the format in which you tell it, because that's a story that is a deeply moving story. It's a really entertaining story, and whatever, but it's head on dealing with a very specific event that is brought on by climate crisis.
Yes, I have had a production company in New York for almost about 20 years, and about 10 years ago, I just said to everybody in my office, we're only going to take any projects if it deals with the environment or climate, and if people call and they start to pitch, just let them know right away that this is the only thing we're looking for right now. And it took a long time, but we started to get scripts and material, and that we were interested in developing and taking further, and we made a film about the true stories of the Radium Girls, who were the dial painters in World War I. And then it turned out that, you know, that had been sort of a precedent-setting case that was still used today by the EPA in terms of corporate power. And this corporate power thing, I think, is a real issue that we need to really unpack and think about all the time. And I don't know how, I mean, we all went through a transformation during the pandemic, but what was really happening for me, I felt like I was feeling, and I had made a movie about World War II right before the pandemic, I was starting to feel this rise in global extremism and a connection to the loss of love with the degradation of the planet. And the relationship between the two things were so strong for me. And I started to think about how can we be so disconnected from nature? How can that happen? Because we are nature ourselves. So how can we set ourselves apart and not be concerned about that? And so I really was looking to create something that was, you know, in that kind of fever dream of the pandemic that was a little bit more emotional. And I remembered a story that I had read by Danny McClain in this anthology called Octavia's Brood. They're science fiction stories from social justice movements. And I called her up and I said, I've got these ideas, you've got this amazing story, can we put them all together and create something? And I made a film, and then I felt like I still wanted more emotional connection to it all. And I was asked to do a little 6-minute piece in a pop-up museum, and I sort of did projectors, and I stacked the sea, the land, the sky, and I felt that people had this reaction to it, that there was something that it was more visceral. And so I was really, I was here with the environmental residency, with Ben's here today, and Alex, and I mentioned to Mayra that I just had been thinking about converting the film into a 3-screen installation, because I felt like if we could see the nature there while all of this other stuff is happening, we can see that we haven't lost it yet. It's still there. In fact, it's us. Right. And and in the multi-screen, the viewer has an opportunity to choose different things to look at different times and to think about these things in a different way. It's a more intimate, immersive experience. So I'm just playing, and I'm playing with the form. I have found it really interesting to play with the frame. And I think that as we, you know, think about our future and we're thinking about creating content in different ways, you know, for our Gen Z generations coming up, I think playing with forming content is exciting. Yeah.
And it is, I can tell you from having seen it, it's like, it is a very visceral experience. I mean, I don't know what you call the sort of, there's the movie, the 3-screen movie, and then there are the other, there are 2 or 3 other installations, right? Video installations that are kind of these video, I would call them
projection paintings.
Okay, and I would say a video sculpture, because they're kind of
There were things there were emotional beats that I didn't feel like I could get into the film, so I created little moments in the gallery where you can sit in a chair and for 2 minutes kind of enter this projection painting of something, an idea, nature.
Yeah, and it's very powerful. And then the experience of watching a movie, a traditional narrative with actors and scenes and a plot on 3 screens is a very it's an immersive experience, and it's a different engagement, I think, in that kind of storytelling. And was that informed at all? I'm curious by it's a science fiction story. Was that? I'd love to hear you. It's like, did that unusual presentation approach, was that informed by the science fiction element of it? And can you talk a little bit about, and any of us talk a little bit about sort of the role in speculative fiction and science fiction in these kinds of storytelling?
Do you want to talk about that?
Well, no, go ahead, and then
Okay, well, I will say I had a very interesting time in London because I did take it to the Science Fiction Festival, the London Science Fiction Festival, and I spent a couple of days with science fiction people, and we were talking a lot about this, and it is very interesting because I think that, the statistics now sort of prove that we're over 50% of that we're living in a virtual simulation, right? And and we all know that we're kind of moving into those gears anyway with our technology. And I think that the science fiction piece of it, to me, I think that, we sort of have a different relationship to time since the pandemic, and we've also got into a lot more discussion about ancestral memory, and I think the multiverses, and I find that very fascinating, and I think that it allows us to, I found for myself working in those kind of realms, it allowed me to be more internal about my visual expression, and allowed me to bring those kind of ideas into visuals that might, connect differently to people. So for me, that's what the science fiction allowed me to bring a time traveler in who could already, it's just interesting to know, to know that somebody else already could see what was going to happen here, but that we all live in a probable future, or a million probable futures. So every decision we make changes our probable future. So.
Great.
And the other thing that I really liked about your film, Lydia, is, I think that there's, sometimes when we talk about science fiction, there's a tendency to think that it has to be Blade Runner or Star Wars, or like these incredibly built worlds that are very expensive to conceive and maybe inaccessible to certain types of filmmakers, or even if you have all the money in the world, it's a certain style of filmmaking. But I think that what I loved about yours is that it's incredibly grounded. And I started to figure out the device of, like, at first, there are 2 characters, in case you haven't seen it, who are kind of in dialogue with each other, but you're seeing them on separate screens, they're not in the same room. And then at a certain point, one of them goes like this, and you realize that they're talking to each other on the phone, but like with this device that doesn't exist. And it's just this tiny thing, this detail that reveals itself in the most natural way. And anyway, and I think that as a filmmaker, there are lots of really interesting choices that you can make when you decide to tackle science fiction that are really different from what you would expect.
I just want to chuck in the brilliance of Adam McKay making a science fiction climate movie. And that I think what people fear is the sweaty earnestness of being cornered by a vegan at a party when they go to a movie. And that approaching, I'm sorry, I'm in Woodstock.
There are no sweaty vegans here.
But but that thing of like approaching the climate crisis as a comedy. Where is Climate Crisis the musical? Which is a ridiculous idea, but go where the audience doesn't expect you to go. Approach this thing from where the audience doesn't expect the story to come. And I think you're so far ahead of the game.
Climate Crisis, the musical, exists. Have you guys seen the SpongeBob musical?
No.
The SpongeBob musical is an allegory about the end of the world, And it's all of the characters dealing with the fact that there's this volcano, like right outside of, what do they call their little towns? Something Bottom, Bikini Bottom, right outside of Bikini Bottom. And it's going to erupt and it's going to ruin them all. And anyway, it's extraordinary. There are
Please do a number.
I can't. I wish I could. But yeah, the SpongeBob musical, guys.
Well, there you go. Go see the SpongeBob musical. Is it still running? I'm not sure. It's running somewhere. But yeah, no, fantastic. I love that. Tim, can you tell us a little bit more about, I mean, you hinted a little bit about the work that you do with all these various organizations. Tell us what motivated that work and what continues, what is the work, how is it continuing, and what is it that you're working towards?
When I was 13 years old, I got a letter from Jacques Cousteau. I wrote Jacques Cousteau a letter. If you're young, Jacques Cousteau invented the scuba tanks and used to have a TV show on called The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau. And Jacques Cousteau wrote me a letter in 1976 talking about the climate crisis as scientists were thinking about it at that time. A man I didn't know who was as famous as you could get took the time to write a letter to someone he didn't know, and changed my life, and I became an environmentalist. So that's my hook. I work in policy. I run an app called Climate Action Now. Lets people take thousands of actions on the climate crisis in seconds. It's free. Climate Action Now. Download it. We plant a tree for you every time you take a certain number of actions. But working with Vice President Gore's organization, got very interested in communicating the climate crisis. And my real area of interest is not talking to the Sierra Club. My real area of interest is, can I get the New York militia to let me come and talk to them? Can I get the most conservative town board? Because that's really where the change needs to happen. And one of the things in terms of thinking about movies around this stuff is, I think it's imperative to think about what matters to your audience. Often, good thinking, liberal people, that can get in the way of communication. Expertise can get in the way of communication. Peter Hedges, who's a writer-director, some of you know, Alex had me come and tell some stories to the young filmmakers he was working with here. And Peter and I are now working on a kind of one-man show of climate change with no science at all in it. I'm going to tell a very fast story and then I'll shut up. I was giving my first talk at a maximum security prison. This sounds weird. I wanted the masculine approval of the incarcerated rapists and murderers. I'm an actor and I wear a lot of makeup, and Phil Hoffman once said my sexuality is like a dog on an ice rink. So I wanted some assurity from these gentlemen, and that's maybe ridiculous but true. And I went in and there were these huge guys, and I started talking about science and radiative forcing, and I looked and I realized I was boring the incarcerated men. I was boring men who had spent decades staring at cement walls, and that is a high bar of messing up in front of an audience. And I did the only thing I could think to do, which was crazy in terms of some weird desire for masculine assurity, which I'm sorry, I'm 60 years old. It's the kind of thing we think about. Which was the only thing I could think to do, which was tell him a poem. It was a poem by a guy named Antonio Machado. It's a fabulous Spanish poet. I won't tell you the whole poem, but the last two lines of the poem, or the last line of the poem is, "What have you done with the garden that was entrusted to you?" What have we done with the garden that was entrusted to us? And saying that to a group of men who'd made a mistake in their lives. And it relates to what we're doing to this planet, is powerful. And then, rather than be the expert, I said, listen, I used to be a drug addict and an alcoholic, and I committed felonies. I used to rob ambulances in New York City. I don't have any judgment about being with you guys. And that's nothing, by the way, I'm proud of. I'm deeply ashamed of that. But opening up in that way, being human, being vulnerable, being the farthest thing I could be from an expert, opened the door. And then we could talk about all the science we wanted to. So there's something about in making a movie about this, I think, about really thinking about the values of the audience, who is the audience you're trying to reach, and different audiences have different needs if you're going to communicate.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. And I think that's a good transition to Meredith. Can you take us into your presentation and talking about the really specific work that you're doing with storytellers?
Yeah, let's dive in.
Great.
Meredith, can I just share that Katie and I we're part of a group of people that convened a WGA and PGA Climate Storytelling Initiative. And it's amazing because it's the first time we've had the entire WGA East and West involved with this interguild effort. And we went through a whole series of trainings, and we did it with NRDC and Meredith. And we've been doing it with our memberships. You know, we have 20,000 writers, we have 8,000 producers, and we were doing it right up until the strike happened, and it was iterative, and it was very interesting to kind of have content creators participate and talk about the creative process in this way. So that's my little setup to what Meredith is going to share with us, because she is working with content creators, she's working with studio executives, and it's really important work. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yeah, we had a lot of fun with that series, and we're hopefully cooking up more. So what I'm going to share with you guys today is a version of, I'll tell you a little bit about my work at Rewrite the Future at NRDC, and then I'll share a version of our presentation that talks about our approach to breaking down climate and how you can incorporate it into your work. It's the mini version, basically, of what Lydia and I have done at the Writers Guild and the Producers Guild. It's a bit shorter. I have 3 things to juggle, so hopefully I only drop one of them. So let's dive in. Thanks for having me here today to do this. What is the NRDC? So in case you don't know, the NRDC is one of the largest, we're one of the big greens. We use law, science, and policy to move the needle on environmental topics. We're really well known for litigation. We sued the Trump administration over 150 times, and we won the vast majority of those cases. And we work a lot on the climate crisis, because obviously that's front burner for everybody. So people often ask climate scientists, is there any reason for hope? We're all swimming around every day in this kind of doom soup. We get a lot of really negative messaging about climate and the environment, and there's a real tendency to feel like all is lost. And the reality is that we actually have bent the projected curve on temperature increase. At a certain point in time, we were expected to hit about 4 degrees by 2100. Now it's closer to, it's below 3, which is good. And that's all because of the mitigations and actions that humans have already taken. And that's a really important fact that doesn't get nearly enough airtime. Anyway, so Rewrite the Future is a group that started at NRDC about 3 years ago. And we leverage the environmental expertise of NRDC to help creators tell stories about our climate-altered world, and also to represent a better future, not just that apocalypse that we see all the time. So we have public discussions. This is an event that we did at the Pacific Design Center a few years back. Every year at Sundance, we do panels, and what we do is we convene artists who've worked in this space and told climate stories, and they talk about their process, which I think is one of the best ways for storytellers to figure out how to, engage in their own process. And all of the past 3 years of panels we did on Zoom, thanks to the pandemic. So those are filmed and on our website. This year's was amazing. It was Roxane Gay and Franklin Leonard in conversation. I definitely recommend that one. But all 3 of them are up there if you're curious to go and watch them. We have a climate storytelling fellowship where we give $20,000 to 3 film or television scripts that deal with climate in a meaningful way. It's a revision fellowship, so then each fellow gets feedback from NRDC experts and from Rewrite the Future, and we pair each fellow with an industry mentor. So we're in our third cycle. This year, the mentors are Roxane Gay, Pamela Adlon, and Dorothy Fortenberry. And then if you're interested in submitting, the cycle that you can submit for it closes November 27th. So if you have a project that touches climate in any way, please submit and let me know if you have more questions after this. I'd be happy to discuss. And then the last part of our work, which takes up an enormous amount of time, is all of the work that we do with studios in the business. We consult on content for them, and then we've also worked really closely with NBC Universal to develop a first-of-its-kind program called Greener Light. Universal Pictures has a program where they now do an environmental review for every project that comes through the film slate, and they look at what Lydia helped develop, their kind of green production guide approach about how do they reduce the carbon footprint of the production, and they also look at story, which is very cool. So we helped them develop that program, and now they're in the midst of rolling it out. So let's dive in. So the real issue here, I think, is that we're really telling ourselves the wrong story about the climate crisis, that it's too big to fix, that it's too late, that one person can't make a difference. And a lot of these narratives are perpetuated and were put out there originally by fossil fuel companies. They've been circulating for like 30 years. This whole idea that fossil fuels are a necessary evil, oh God, it's just too hard to wean ourselves off of them. That's propaganda, ladies and gentlemen. So the entertainment industry for a long time has both reflected and influenced culture on really important topics, ranging from gender to homosexuality to racism. But the climate crisis is largely missing. We don't see our climate-altered world on screen. And it's interesting. So you referenced this study, Lydia. 0.6% of scripts, there was an analysis done of 76,000 screenplays, 0.6% of them mentioned the words climate change. I think it was 2.6% of them even used any kind of language related to the climate crisis. And interestingly, there's new research that a group called RARE did, which showed that 70% of audiences would like to see climate solutions reflected in the content that they watch. So there's this enormous gulf, this enormous opportunity. And also talent wants it too. Variety did a study, 70% of talent are engaged in climate advocacy or climate-friendly actions off screen. Meryl Streep also called Don't Look Up the most important film of her career, so maybe we should just all stop there. Anyways, so why are there so few stories about climate? It's all the things that we've been talking about. People are worried it's boring, politically divisive, and maybe they're even feeling like they don't know how to deal with it themselves, so how could they possibly deal with it in a story? So we have an approach, some new ways of thinking about climate representation that I think help storytellers to see it as an opportunity as opposed to an impediment. So this is one of my favorite things. I think about this all the time, this climate storytelling continuum. So there's an enormous range to the ways that climate and environmental topics can come up. And the good news is that you don't need to go out and come up with a whole new slate of projects in order to do this. Really, it's very simple. Look at the content you have, ask yourself, how does climate touch the story? So on the left, you'll see sort of, the most obvious offenders in the climate space. Movies that are all about climate, stories that are all about climate. In the documentary space, it would be Inconvenient Truth. In the climate space, it's, dark, or film space, it's like, Dark Waters, Avatar. But then when it starts to get interesting is when you start moving to the right across the continuum and you see content that's dealt with climate and environmental topics, either as context, showing characters in relationship with nature, or dealing with it even as a subplot, or just a mention, or something that a character is grappling with. And then, the other thing that I think really makes a difference is to show sustainable actions on screen. All of these are examples of content that's not about climate or environment at all, but they've incorporated, whether it's EVs or sustainable fashion or just characters talking about climate. Rob Lowe's vegan, that's why he hasn't aged. And then, I think when you're thinking of how to start, just start by reflecting our current reality, right? We're all worried about climate, we're all talking about it with our friends, we're trying to figure out where should we live, or, some people are even wrestling with whether or not to have children. So I think that's the first thing, right? Start with our reality. Dorothy Fortenberry had a lot to say about this at one of our Sundance panels, so I'm gonna let her say it because she says it best.
I think any story can and probably should be a climate change story. I think it's sort of like, are walls entertaining? I don't know, but most TV shows have them. Climate change is just as much a part of our reality as walls. So it should be in TV shows as much as walls are. And maybe the episode is about the walls, or maybe they're just there, but they influence everybody's decisions because you have to go, around them or through a door or whatever. So I think there's a part of me that feels like if we just made a small adjustment to make it reality, that would be enormous.
So you guys know that good stories aren't about issues, they're about people. So I think one of the best places to start is character. This is an episode of Big Little Lies where Laura Dern's character's daughter has a nervous breakdown and ends up in the hospital. And the storytellers could have chosen any reason, but in this case they chose climate anxiety. Characters' jobs are an excellent way in. Political and legal shows have dealt with climate and environment, and then obviously first responder shows. There are lots of unfortunate natural ways in because of our awesome new normal of wildfires and flash floods and whatnot. Where do they live? Settings are a really great angle. This is a still from a 30 years in the future storyline in The Affair, where sea level rise had destroyed Montauk. And settings can also highlight climate solutions. This is Apricot Lane, AKA the biggest little farm, which is a beacon in sustainable farming. Characters' emotions are obviously a really easy way in. There's a recent study that showed that it studied thousands of youth worldwide, and 84% of them said that they were incredibly, incredibly concerned about climate change and that it was affecting their daily lives. And half of them said that when they talk about climate, they feel dismissed and ignored. Whoa, way far ahead. This is a Tinder ad. It's a real Tinder ad. They noticed that users on the platform were very concerned about climate. So that's a couple squaring off against a trash monster. OkCupid noticed the same thing. In 2022, climate change was the #1 most important issue for users on the platform, and 90% of them said that not caring about climate change was a deal breaker. All right, so now I'm gonna give it to Sarah Treem, who is the creator of The Affair. She has some really great insight into climate emotions. This is from our Sundance panel a few years ago.
What we were trying to do for this show, and what I think is interesting to think about when you think about incorporating climate change into narratives, is that people are very worried, actually, about climate change. It's a real anxiety, and it's hanging over all of us. And we're all kind of in denial about it because it's too scary to think about. It involves the legacy of our children. It involves the world that we're leaving them. We don't actually feel like we have any control over it, and so. But that kind of anxiety is a real character motivator. Like anything else, like any other kind of thing that the character is in denial about, like any other thing that the character doesn't want to see. But is significantly influencing their actions. It's very much something that you could incorporate into character.
So one of the things that we know about climate change is that the global south is being impacted more than those of us in the global north typically. and they're also have much lower carbon footprints, sort of least responsible for climate change. The impacts are not equal. And we also know that Black teens suffer much higher rates of asthma because they live in areas with worse pollution, often with scary factories in their backyards. But the thing that's really interesting is that we often see that these communities that are most closely impacted by climate change are coming up with solutions. Across the country, NRDC partners with a lot of these local activists who either have blown the whistle in their communities or are coming up with solutions in their own communities and trying to figure out the resources and how to deploy them. It's incredibly inspiring. But stories like these about real people making change in their world don't often make it to the screen. I mean, it's been a long time since Erin Brockovich, right? And I think that what happens is that leaves audiences stranded in this thing that Tony Leiserowitz at Yale calls the hope gap. It's the despair that you feel when you don't know how to stop the world from burning up. And as you were discussing, hope comes from taking action. And I think that's one of the things that, we need to all connect the dots in our own lives, and we need to see it role modeled on screen to understand that it's possible and, fun. So anyway, and as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, there are a lot of really inspiring stories right now, particularly amongst youth activists. Kids are lobbying their PTAs at school to get better climate curriculum and incorporate it into their education. There's a landmark lawsuit in Montana where a bunch of young people sued the state because, its sort of openness to, fossil fuel companies they said was infringing upon their constitutional right because they weren't taking the possibility of climate change into account, and they were successful. And there are more lawsuits like that are coming through the system. It's very exciting and cool. And I think there's a book proposal floating around out there, or a book right now that's actually about this. So hopefully someone options that. So, I think it's really important to imagine a better future. Wakanda is a great example of a story that puts, it showcases an equitable future where civilization exists in harmony with nature, there's a balance, and it's very aspirational and hopeful, not apocalyptic at all. And I think we're also really interested at NRDC. Right now we're in the messy middle with climate change, right? And we want to see more stories about that messy middle, about entrepreneurs figuring out, what is our future going to look like? There's so many interesting stories when people are trying to, in real time, reinvent their world. And I think it would be great to see stories that envision, a greener, brighter future, not just the ones where we kind of fail to meet the goals that we've given ourselves. And let's not forget, a green economy can still have murders and affairs and corruption and all the things that go into a great story. Climate change, it also doesn't need to be divisive. Yellowstone shows that audiences across the political spectrum will engage with stories that are, about being in relationship with the land and fighting for what you love. And then there's a great storyline. A lot of the time people think that climate and environmental topics maybe won't come up in period content. And there's a great episode of The Crown that deals with the Great Fog of 1952, which is a real thing. I mean, obviously it's The Crown. But thousands of Londoners, died because there was this massive fog that descended on the city. It was from air pollution, from industrialization. And I think that there are also opportunities. There are a lot of tropes in representing climate on screen, liberals and eco-terrorists, and those are the people who believe in, fighting for the environment, and the rest of us kind of don't. But if you look out at the real world, there are oil workers retraining as wind engineers right now. Globally, the military believes that climate change is a threat because it contributes to destabilization of governments, so they're really worried about it. And there are church leaders who, sometimes at great personal risk, are advocating within their congregations. So these people exist, and you really just need to look out there and you'll see them. Climate can also come up in all sorts of genres, from drama to comedy. And one thing that I find particularly sort of funny that all of us are up against all the time is our own hypocrisy. We live in a world that's structured around fossil fuels, and so it's really difficult to be perfect at anything, Maybe you work really hard to recycle properly, but still drive an old gas guzzling car. Maybe you give to the NRDC, but you can't resist going on vacation at the Four Seasons. You know, those kinds of things. I've done that. And then, you know, I think that it's really interesting, though, to unpack these daily contradictions on screen, right? I mean, none of us can go to the grocery store without coming home with an armload of plastic. So let's change that. There's also, if you're looking for, you know, business and creative cases, because everybody in the industry feels much more comfortable when they see those. Ted Lasso is a great example. There's a storyline in season 2 where Sam Obusanya, who's a Nigerian player, discovers that the team's sponsor is polluting his homeland, and so he tapes their name over on his jersey. The whole team tapes their names over. It becomes this really successful collective action. Don't Look Up, we've talked about, obviously a big success case. Jurassic World Dominion, lesser focused upon, but the villain in that story is using dinosaur genetics to exploit the global food supply, which is obviously a really terrible plan. And then one of my personal favorites is Parasite. I don't know if you remember the rainstorm towards the end of Parasite, but it dramatizes the unequal impact of climate change. I was actually thinking about it as I was landing in Newark on Friday night, and people's basement apartments were flooding in New York. And then, of course, there's my favorite creative and business case for climate and environmental content, the Avatar franchise, which I think really just shows that people do engage on a primal level with this struggle to restore balance in nature. I also have just some basic advice for you guys that we've, you know, talked about a lot as we think about, like, how do you make this work in a business context? Dorothy Fortenberry, who you saw earlier, said something really funny, which is basically, don't sell your story as a climate story, sell it as a sexy zombie story, and then make it about climate too. And I think that works through the whole process. Like when you're pitching it, when it's set up at a studio and you're pitching it to your bosses as an executive, and then when you're marketing it, right? Like Last of Us actually is the perfect example. You know, the whole reason that those characters were zombies is because the warming planet enabled the fungus to live in the human body. It's a great example of climate change as context. And the other thing that I think is really important to think about, the commissioner of the BBC said that, you know, when they look at their slate, they have 1 slot a year for a climate project, and the rest of the time they're counting on climate and environment to come up in all of those other projects that are about other things. They actually really actively do want to see it, which is great. And then I think, you know, as you're also thinking about your projects, a lot of the time people rule out, you know, oh, it's too late, like I'm in pre-production, there's nothing I can do. And I'll tell you that at Rewrite the Future, we come in all the time a few weeks out and people will be like, what can I do that's really targeted? Like lines of dialogue, on-screen actions, simple things. And there's always something that you can do with a script or with a story, even if you think that you don't have time. So I'd say it's never too late. And then look at Green Production Guide for sustainable, you know, filmmaking. We also, at NRDC, we have an entertainment partnerships team that does all of our online and sort of like world-facing work. We just did a really fun Nick Offerman collaboration about sustainable farming and soil health. It's incredibly funny. So anyway, that team exists to help partner on impact campaigns, because a lot of the time there are really neat impact campaigns that you can do, kind of getting people to take action after the fact. So Rewrite the Future, I've talked about this a bunch. You know, we collaborate with filmmakers at all stages of the process. Sometimes it's, you know, giving filmmakers the science to help them build worlds. Sometimes it's late stage consulting. You know, we also have 700 subject matter experts internally. So we do, you know, veracity checks on scripts and bring in scientists to consult on things. And all of our work is underwritten by our funders, so it's available to storytellers at no charge. So I'll leave you with a quote from Norman Lear. This is our century, yours and mine. Let us encourage one another with visions of a shared future, and let us bring all the grit and open-heartedness and creative spirit that we can muster to gather together and build that future. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. That was really fantastic and really inspiring, and thank you for the incredible work that you're doing.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, it was really great. And just speaking to, just anecdotally, like in terms of the ways that we intentionally and unintentionally, and hopefully more intentionally, incorporate that storytelling, these kinds of storytelling into our own work. Like when we were preparing for this panel, somebody asked me, maybe it was you, if I wanted to talk about the climate content in the movie Land that I produced, and I said I don't really think it was about that and whatever, and then there it is in your in one of your slides, I started to think about more about what that was, but so thank you. That was really wonderful. I think we're at that point where we need to open up to questions from the audience, unless anybody has anything else, last thing they want to say before we address things.
One just very, very quick thing. You know, another very impactful thing movies can do is have sustainable production. I was in a movie called Sweetland that was the first carbon neutral independent movie, and we had no money whatsoever. The I Don't Have Any Money was the first feature by this director. That the excuse of I don't have any money, et cetera, really doesn't work. It takes a little thought. The PGA Green resource is extraordinary. There's all kinds of help that's out there now. And by the way, it also got us on like NPR and wound up giving us, you know, but that's possible and shouldn't be an excuse.
No, it should be inexcusable not to do it, to be honest. A lot of people have been doing it for a long time. So, questions? Yes. Are we going to bring you a mic so everybody can hear?
Hi. My name is Samantha. I actually work in the sustainability development area. And I'm sure that a few of you were at Climate Week last week, I bet, right? So just two comments. I really admire all the work that you're doing. Would love to collaborate with you, for sure, both through filmmaking and advocacy. I do a lot of work with corporate foundation relations. And what I'm struck by is with the growth of corporate social responsibility and sustainability, now climate change programs, there still isn't enough storytelling. These corporations have the ability and the funds to do more documentaries. As you know, Unilever, sorry Nilo, he's also very active in the climate space too. Unilever's brands, they've made a commitment with their nature-based solutions that they will only market consumer-friendly products. They've done a lot of surveys, so they're very high on my list. But there's still a lack of narrative. It's just CSR reports, it's ads like the latest Apple ad that we saw. What can we do to move the needle on this narrative that these companies have the power to tell? We've all heard about the lawsuit in California against the fossil fuel companies that was enforced by the state of California. A lot of things are slipping through the cracks, and film and narrative is the only way to cut through this and educate people and enforce platforms like you're doing to take action and join in. What else can we do, and what are the major challenges? It's a big question I'm asking you, but if we crack this nut, we could have more action. Thank you.
Yeah, toward the end of the Writers Guild strike, we did a climate labor themed picket with the March to End Fossil Fuels. And I spent some time thinking about it that day, about how I was going to weave the fossil fuel and the narrative and the climate storytelling all together. And it's interesting because that statistic about the 74% of the people that really want to see climate narratives, it mirrors what we now know, but we don't believe is our climate supermajority. Because the Yale Climate Communications Program did a study and revealed that it's really about 2/3 of the American population that believes in major policy change around climate. But we think we're 1/3. And they went around in every state in our country and asked people, where's the majority? Well, we're only 1/3, 2/3 of the people are against it. And that's a narrative that Yale's program says has been perpetuated by the fossil fuel companies to make people feel helpless, to make people feel that we don't have enough power to stand up to what we're doing. So we really started the chant on the picket line of take back the narrative, because this is what I think we really do have to believe in the agency that we have. The statistics are bearing it out, but the powers that be are putting the misinformation out there to make us feel powerless.
Yeah, and I think I think consumer behavior is also changing. I actually was just reading a McKinsey report about it the other day, about how consumers, are really motivated by sustainability when they make purchasing choices. So when you look at all of the different data points in the constellation, it is irrefutable. But yes, the narrative against it is strong. Nobody wants to be the vegan at the dinner party or the annoying feminist or whatever. Like, we've all been kind of brainwashed not to be these things. Yeah.
I would also just chuck into that what you pointed out is very astute, and there are a lot of targets that need to hear from us. It isn't just government. It's not just the fossil fuel companies. I'm pitching that Climate Action Now app again, because one of the things we've been concentrating on recently is the lawyers who represent the fossil fuel companies, the advertising firms who represent the fossil fuel companies, the insurance companies that insure fossil fuel pipelines. There are multiple targets, if you will, and that we need to hit.
And the insurance companies are particularly annoying because they're canceling people's policies in California and other places where they're vulnerable, and at the same time still insuring the fossil fuel business.
So I have a couple thoughts and comments, and I've been doing a lot in this space for many years. I don't think people are aware that one of the largest uses of fossil fuels now is in plastic that's used on organic farms. It's a huge problem. And they used to burn it at the end because the plastic only lasts for a year or two. They're now mulching it into our soils. And after 10 years, so these giant organic farms that we're going and spending all kinds of money to buy in the store, Whole Foods and whatnot, is being grown in microplastic. And that's all fossil fuels. So that's probably the biggest use of fossil fuels right now. It's amazing how many people don't understand that. The second thing is, I have an assistant who buys everything on Amazon. She's 20-something years old. No matter how many times I say, look, 10 pounds of packaging came in this little box of vegan cheese that I got for me, huge styrofoam box. And the third thing I want to say is I started making a film on pesticide years ago, and what got to me is our government is so screwed up right now, and no legislation is getting passed. And until we get money out of politics, it doesn't matter how much advocacy we do. We're not going to make a change until the agencies that oversee what our legislatures decide on are not being thrown money by corporations. And that sounds, it's not really a question or anything, but that's where I am right now.
Really important. Thank you for sharing all of that with us.
I want to just say, I wanted to raise also hope. I love you, but we're not going to leave this room with that negative, right? Only lost, no, let me finish. And so I agree. Yeah, I'm a big climate activist. Our company is Arcadia.Earth. You can look it up. We do a lot of collaborations with the Robert Downey Jr. foundations and other. The problem is the funds. A lot of organizations right now within climate actions only operate within a nonprofit 501c3. And I think we need to change that. And we need to also inspire people to do for business for profit at a good hope, and not necessarily every time you do something that is for good, you have to be a 501c3, because then it's a problem to receiving funds and processing funds. So I don't know, you guys 501c3 or you're for profit, which one?
NRDC is a 501c3, but then also has an action arm called E2, which is set up separately to help green
So
business.
that's very interesting, right? So that's where I would like to put the focus in saying like we should give people the opportunity to be funded for the project that they do without having to deal with the struggle of the nonprofit or foundation.
Yeah, and I think the Inflation Reduction Act has been incredibly helpful, just
Massive.
putting a big basket of money out there for everybody to hopefully incentivize them to move in the right direction.
Can I
Right.
say one more thing too? Sorry, I'm on the board of Woods Hole Oceanographic right now, and the other thing, there is hope. The CDR that they're doing and they're testing right now, the robots they have all over the Atlantic Ocean. There are 3 technologies which we know we have to remove carbon dioxide to reverse some things at this point. But I encourage everybody to go on their website and see what they're doing, because it's phenomenal. The phytoplankton, ferrous sulfate seeding, seaweed farms, they're bicarbonate spreading. Katie Carpenter and I are doing a film right now with the scientists from Woods Hole showing. And when I take him to Peter Dominical to talk at events, people stand up and say, this is the first time I've been at a climate change talk where I have hope to lead. So there is hope.
That is fantastic. So there is a lot of science that's coming from this, and I think what you were just saying, Meredith, and that speaks to what you were saying. The Inflation Reduction Act did bring in a lot of government funding that's also attracting a lot of private investment, and we have this public-private partnership where people are looking, hey, this is a business opportunity, and there's a lot of that going on, and we need to amplify those narratives as well. Do we have a question over here?
Thank you so much for what you're doing, and the things that you've brought up are so important. 30 years ago, I worked on a film at HBO called The Burning Season, which was the burning of the rainforest and for, cutting it down for cattle feed, for McDonald's, burgers, and so forth. Flashing forward, and in the thought of A Picture Tells 1,000 Words and the films that you're talking about, these are all great films and television shows, and they're out there and then they disappear. And when we talk about more than 60%, 2/3 of Americans care about the climate, and the children, the vast majority of them do, and yet you have a debate where the Republicans, how many believe in climate change, and there's no one. So how can a message using media, using entertainment, that voters all support get to the politicians to help with passing legislation that shows this is what the American people want, or globally the people want, using the power of media and entertainment?
Anybody want? I think politicians, they Netflix and chill too, so they're watching stuff. How do we?
Just a couple quick thoughts. Number one, don't look up, and I don't know that this is still true, but at the time it came out, it was the most popular show in the history of Netflix. So we know that there can be popularity among telling these stories. Number two, the notion that all Republicans don't care about this isn't true. There is conclusive evidence that particularly young Republicans are caring more and more and more about this. And in fact, it's a strategic issue for the Republican Party because they're going to see a kind of a split unless they find some way to adjust to that. I think that there are ways to tell stories to everybody. I passed a law that I signed into law a week ago Friday to force companies to say who was insuring their pipelines in New York State. That law was passed with unanimous bipartisan support because I spoke to Republicans in terms that mattered to them. I think one of the problems that we often have as environmentalists is we avoid speaking to a side that might make us uncomfortable on some level, and that's a disaster. We've got to speak to those folks because it's not a polemic issue. Everybody will tell you they want clean air and clean water, and we just have to find ways to bring them around.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm the founder of a Rockaway Beach nonprofit called the NYC Plover Project, and we're working to protect the one endangered species that lives in New York City, that nests in New York City. And to get Democratic lawmakers, so we'll talk about the Democrats now too, to get the Democratic lawmakers to care about the biodiversity crisis in our city, the largest city, has been near close to impossible. But everyone wants to talk about coastal resilience and climate change. So my question is, how do we, and we also have Democratic lawmakers like Amy Klobuchar and Tammy Baldwin coming for endangered species protections for CAPEX to the loggers. So money in politics is really the issue here. But I think that the reality is that biodiversity, if climate stories aren't popular, biodiversity stories are even less popular. I mean, we saw films like EO and Cow, which were just awesome, about farmed animals primarily. But how do we break out of the nature documentaries, which are beautiful, and we all grew up on them, and they revolutionized the way I think of things, and also the good work that Apple and Netflix have done with nature docs. But like, how do we center the stories of animals and wildlife that I would argue climate change is impacting at a far greater rate than it is any human on this planet?
I mean, I think that there's tremendous opportunity, because I think that the second you start learning about how ecosystems function, it's so incredible that it's impossible not to be awestruck. And I think I see a lot of opportunity, particularly in a lot of different forms of content, but particularly animation. And it's interesting, if you look at animation, there are tons of examples of animated stories engaging with biodiversity and with, you know, nature. I mean, Rio 2 is an incredible example. That movie is kind of all about saving the rainforest. And I think, you know, Moana engages with it on some level. Like, there are numerous examples, but I totally agree with you that there is, Octonauts is an incredible example of like a show for really young kids that interestingly started off not taking climate change, not dealing with it really head on, like trying to deal with it for kids at a young age, just making it all about like these animals, figuring out solutions. And then now it really over the years has evolved and is kind of taking on climate change head on in a way that's very interesting and bold. And I think we obviously need a hell of a lot more of it. I'm not saying that there's enough out there, but I do think that there's tremendous promise in it. And I think that, you know, Avatar is an all audience example, right, of a really incredible movie that just makes it like aspirational. Like, you just want to be in that world when you watch it on screen. I think that's how you do it.
I think we have time for one or two more.
Is it on?
Yep.
My name's David Lowy. I guess I'm stepping out of character here. So I'm not a photographer for the next few minutes. True confessions, I am a retired corporate vice president of environmental affairs for a Fortune 25 corporation. And I've worked in 25 different countries. I've written policies. I was at Rio 1, the Earth Summit, and back then we were talking about using a baseline carbon level going back to 1970. It's now almost 50 years later, and we just haven't made that much progress. It's pretty depressing. The things that used to get us excited back then was to see a story in the New York Times on the front page above the fold. You know, how often does that happen? But let me just leave you with a couple of thoughts. You've all said really interesting and constructive things, and I'm afraid I'm a little bit out of touch with what's been going on lately, but Amory Lovins, who you probably know or know of, once said that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone, and the fossil fuel age is not going to end because we run out of fossil fuels, and I believe that. On the other hand, there's a fellow in New Jersey by the name of Peter Sandman. I don't know if anybody's heard of him. And I worked with him for a while, and he came up with an incredibly simple equation that helps to put all of these challenges in perspective. And it's quite simply risk equals hazard plus outrage. So if you try to assess the risk, why aren't people responding? Why aren't they doing what you want? Irrespective of who the audience is, you have to quantify the hazard, which can be done in real terms, and you have to be able to show that there's outrage. If there's no outrage, it's not going to be perceived as a real risk. And it's a very handy little equation. I've got 4 pages of notes from what you guys said.
I actually would like to just, I appreciate what you're saying, and there was one thing that I really wanted us to just acknowledge today, which is there is a transition to clean energy that's happening, and it's one of the most important things that's happening around climate. And in our industry, we finally got the studios to aggregate their data around what is the biggest emissions factor on our film and television sets, and it's fuel and power. It doesn't matter if it's an independent film, an episode of television, a feature film, a tentpole movie, over 50, could be 55, 56% of your carbon footprint is fuel and power. And we really switched our attention to, like, okay, we all got the recycling thing down, we've got this, but let's really look at clean energy and how do we get the diesel generators off our sets? How do we bring the renewable diesel into our cities? Our Interguild Alliance with the Directors Guild, the Teamsters, the PGA, we formed a clean energy working group, and we have brought renewable diesel into the city. It's going to be available in New York City this coming fall, and the city itself is now going to power all the city vehicles, including the sanitation trucks and the garbage truck. Everything is going to be on clean energy, renewable diesel. So renewable diesel cuts the emissions 80% before we can make the complete transfer to electric. But we are talking about the need to electrify our fleets on our film and television sets, and this is just a subset of what the world is doing and what's happening. And there was a 7-page spread in the New York Times about a month ago where Al Gore was talking about the inflection point where we are. And we've all been wanting to have the clean energy. We all walked by Sarah's solar panels here on the walkway. But it's happening now in terms of a tipping point where it's not an outlier thing to do, it is the thing to do. Right. And that's also pushing infrastructure to support it, which is what we've needed. We've got the supply chain and we've got the infrastructure, but it's happening, and it's kind of amazing to be so close to it and watch it, even over the last 24 months, how much stuff is coming over the transom every day. We've solar trailers, hybrid generators. Renewable diesel is not the same as biodiesel. Renewable diesel because a lot of people have had problems with the biodiesel and temperatures, and renewable diesel is a drop-in fuel. It's sold at the pump in LA at Conoco, 76, Phillips. I mean, it's available all up and down the West Coast, but it's made in a different way than what is known as biodiesel. Yeah, no, I just wanted to put this out. I just wanted to put this out there because I think it's an important.
Okay. I think what you're talking about is what can we do that's most effective right now, and I think that those are really important things. I think we have time for one more comment. Do you want to say something very quickly?
Very quickly. You're communicators. You want to tell a story, and given the equation that I just shared with you, I think that calling climate change crisis is part of the problem. I'm not saying that it isn't, it is, but people have different perceptions of crisis. I used to lecture to high school students and try to get them interested in this. And my solution was, what JFK did with a commitment to put a man, woman, somebody on the moon and bring them back, an objective that spans multiple administrations, et cetera. We need a corollary to that. And we're limited by some of the structures that we have in place in Washington and all around the world.
That's a really important point. I think we're all still searching for the right language to talk that is inspirational and motivational, and it's important to find those words. Tim, you had something that you wanted to say?
Chuck a last story out, but do you want to?
Can we just do we have one more? We have one more question back here, and I love how passionate everybody is about this topic. And
hi, thank you all so much. I work in books, so it's always really interesting to me to see how a different medium addresses the climate crisis, because it's like a lot of what I think about in the work I do. I'm curious, just kind of like as a parting note, and I'm loath to think about like trends, because I agree climate change is the walls, they're everywhere. But like with books, I think a lot about how sort of the immediate future is something that's become a really big trend in fiction because people find it very uncanny to think about the immediate future because it's so similar to ours. Or, you know, another trend we're seeing is like reporting on margin lands and like margin communities. And so I'm curious if you all have seen trends in the climate space in terms of topics or areas that have been covered recently that it seems like there's a lot of, for lack of a better word, heat on it. Or if there's, you know, areas that you're interested in that you feel like haven't really gotten the attention that perhaps they deserve. I know that's like every topic in the world hasn't gotten the attention it deserves, but yeah, I'm just curious about like coverage in that kind of way.
Well, I have found, and it's kind of interesting because in dabbling in the science fiction a little bit, I have found that the shows and the stories that go too far into the future are not necessarily helpful because it starts to get like you're making it up. You know, I found Kim Stanley Robinson's book Ministry of the Future very interesting. It goes to 2040, and I sort of found that to be the 2030, 2040 is sort of like something we can wrap our arms around in terms of what we can actually do and see where we can get to.
So you're finding near future similarly as a trend, yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting what people call near future, right? Because a lot of people's net zero goals are in that 2050, 2060 range, and I think we've got to get there by 2030, 2040.
Yeah, a lot of what I is like late 2020s.
Right.
That are like literally set like 5 or 6 years in the future.
Right.
I think it's helpful to think that because I don't think that we don't think enough about our own future and where we're going to be. And that's my favorite question is to ask somebody where are they going to be in 10 years, you know, and to really put that hat on and talk about it.
Great.
Well,
and
I was just going to say, I think that there are also numerous opportunities in our present, right? Like, for example, I don't know if you guys are obsessed with Succession like I am. I watched that entire show thinking, why hasn't somebody made Succession in the fossil fuel business? Like, oh my God, that would be amazing. It would be so juicy. There would be so much scandal and power and oh my God. And like, oh, and it would be about something. And all the best stories are. So, yeah.
Very true. And I'm getting a lot of there's so much to talk about on this topic, but I'm getting a lot of signals to wrap things up. So maybe Tim will let you take us out with a little story.
So I'm going to just tell a sort of 3-minute something. When my mother was pregnant with me, she went to a cocktail party, which is apparently what people in the 1960s did when you were pregnant. And a dog wound its way through the crowd of people and walked up to my mother and stared at her stomach and started barking ferociously at my mother, and her water broke and I was born. And I've always thought that the dogs wanted me to come out and play. That's my crazy thing. I have a dog named Finn, who I love this dog. He was a wild dog in the Bronx, and we brought him home, and he would bite us until we had blood running down our arms, and he was a monster. And then one day my wife went running with him, and there was a windstorm, and a branch fell down and hit him on the back, and he couldn't move. And I laid with him on the floor for about 10 days, and he recovered, and we bonded, and I've never felt a connection with an animal like that. On Monday, I had to put him down after 16 years. I had to do that terrible thing of deciding what was best and putting a needle in this dog. I'm sorry you have to hear this. Cover your ears back there. And the next day, I had to go to Washington to work on climate stuff that's in the Farm Bill, which I did in no way because there's some heroic part of me doing climate blah, blah, blah. The day before I carried that old skinny dog out onto the farm porch, drooping with lack of energy, and he lifted his head up and he smelled the air. And you know, dogs, scientists tell us their sense of smell is 10,000 to 100,000 times more powerful than ours. So he was smelling this mystery, this extraordinary mystery that we're all part of. We live in the Catskills. When you take the window up at night, if you live here, you'll know this. All the time, I hear weird noises from the woods that I don't know, what the hell is that? These very strange noises happen. We're surrounded by mystery and wonder. Last week I was with Riverkeeper. We were out in New York Harbor. We saw 4 humpback whales, 3 minke whales, and a pod of bottlenose dolphins with Manhattan in the background. The miracle is so close. The miracle is in this room. The miracle is in your breath. The miracle is in the people sitting next to you. And I believe none of you are here if you don't have an interest in the climate crisis. And what I want to say to you is that you are all the guardians of the miracle of existence. And I thank you for that. This work sometimes feels lonely. Right around you right now, there's a crowd. I think the animals and the plants thank you. I think your ancestors thank you. I think future generations are going to look back and thank you for the work you're doing right now. When I bury Finn, in a single teaspoon of healthy soil, there are 3 billion microorganisms. We live in ecstatic miracle. So I hope that we all keep raising our noses in the air and smelling that miracle and doing everything we can to defend it. And I thank all of you for coming here and inspiring me today.
Thank you. Thank you all. That was really beautiful, Tim. And thank you all for being here at the last panel of this festival. And I'm going to take your idea and what you just said, and let's rebrand the climate crisis as the climate miracle. It really is it's an opportunity. We do have an opportunity to all effectuate real change. So thank you all for being here today.